Dawn crept over the frozen grasslands in a slow, colorless sweep, the kind of cold morning that silenced even the wind. The rangeland stretched empty in every direction. A pale horizon pressed against the sky until 3 cowboys on horseback noticed shapes that did not belong there. At first the figures looked like discarded sacks caught against the fence line, but the stillness around them felt wrong, too heavy, too human. The horses slowed on their own, snorting at the scent of fear that lingered in the air. As the men rode closer, the faint outline of bodies sharpened. 3 women lay collapsed near the wire, their limbs folded awkwardly beneath them as if they had fought the ground before surrendering to it. Frost clung to their hair and sleeves. Their chests rose in small, uneven breaths, barely enough to keep them tethered to consciousness. The cowboys exchanged a quiet glance. This stretch of land bordered the POW camp. Whoever these women were, they had not made it far. One of the cowboys dismounted, boots sinking into the hardened soil. He moved slowly, knowing instinct alone might startle them. When he knelt, one woman's eyes opened in a terrified flinch, her body pulling back though she could not lift herself. Another tried to crawl, but her arms trembled and gave out. The third stayed curled on her side, lips moving in a breathless whisper that vanished into the cold air. The men froze, unsure if they were witnessing injury, illness, or something deeper. Something shaped by a fear they did not yet understand. Nothing in their training had prepared them for the sight of people too frightened to accept the simplest offer of help. The women's terror, sharp and silent, hovered heavier than the cold itself and left a single unresolved question hanging in the morning light. Why were they alone out here, and what had made them so afraid to be found? The wind skimmed low across the plains, carrying dust, silence, and the barely formed whispers of the 3 women huddled against the fence line. Their voices trembled more from memory than from cold. Even as the cowboys kept their distance, speaking softly to one another, the women shrank into themselves, repeating warnings they had been taught long before this land, long before this morning. The words were fractured, shaped by exhaustion, but the fear behind them was whole and unbroken. They had been told that foreign captors made prisoners vanish without a sound, that those who accepted help were taken first, that weakness marked the beginning of disappearance. It did not matter that the cowboys looked confused rather than threatening, or that their movements were slow and measured. The women's instinct was older than this moment. It had been carved into them by months of rumor, reinforced by the kind of stories whispered in barracks where fear could grow unchecked. Help, they had been told, was the beginning of harm. One woman pressed her face into the crook of her arm, her shoulders shaking as she whispered to the others. Another kept her gaze fixed on the cowboy's boots, as if the slightest shift might confirm everything she had been warned about. The third, still struggling to breathe evenly, tried to push herself upright before collapsing again, the effort stealing what little strength she had left. The cowboys watched, each step they didn't take becoming a kind of unspoken reassurance. Their faces showed worry, not anger, confusion, not impatience. Yet the calm in their posture only deepened the women's panic. Nothing frightened them more than kindness they didn't know how to trust. Across the empty plains, the mistrust felt heavier than the cold. The men understood they were dealing with hunger and exhaustion, but what lay under that? This instinctive recoil from help remained a mystery too fragile to touch. The women clung to their warnings as the wind carried their whispers west, leaving the cowboys to realize something far more difficult than rescue was ahead. Overcoming fear built long before Texas ever saw their faces. He moved slower than the others, letting the dust settle around his boots. Before he took another step, the morning light gathered along the brim of his hat, softening the edges of a man who understood animals, storms, and soil far better than he understood fear shaped by war. Still, something in the women's trembling pulled him closer. Not with confidence, but with caution. He knelt in the dirt, not to approach them, but to lower himself to a height that felt less threatening. From there, he could see their breathing quiver in shallow bursts, each inhale fighting through exhaustion and dread. Their shoulders twitched at the slightest motion, flinching even when no one moved. The collapse wasn't just from hunger or cold. It was fear wearing down a body already stretched too far. He studied the smallest details, the way one woman kept her hands curled protectively near her chest, the way another stared past him as if bracing for a blow that never came, the way the third couldn't stop trembling even though the air was still. Fear wasn't just present. It was contagious. He could see it travel from one to the next like a silent warning passed across shared glances. He exhaled slowly, dust rising around his knees. Every instinct told him to reach out, to steady the closest woman before she fell again. But another instinct, a deeper, quiet-eyeder one, warned him that even a gentle hand might break whatever fragile control they had left. Duty urged him forward. Compassion held him back. He felt the weight of both as he watched them, unsure which choice would do less harm. His job was to help, yet helping too quickly had already caused panic. So he stayed where he was, hands resting in the dirt, letting the moment stretch without pressure. He waited for fear to ease enough that they could decide whether his presence meant danger, or something else entirely. Fear did not begin on the Texas plains. It had crossed an ocean with them, folded into memory long before their boots ever touched American soil. As the women huddled close, breaths unsteady, the weight of those lessons pressed harder than hunger or cold. They had been taught what happened to prisoners who showed weakness, what foreign hands were rumored to do, and why silence, above all else, was survival. In the dim barracks they once lived in, older voices had whispered warnings shaped by desperation and war. Foreign brutality, they said, did not always announce itself. Captors tested the weak first. Those who fell behind were taken away quietly, leaving only empty mats and unanswered questions. Even tending to an injured friend could mark someone as a liability, and liabilities weren't kept. The stories grew sharper in their retelling, etched into the women's instincts like rules carved into stone. Falling was dangerous. Accepting help was worse. If a soldier pulled someone to their feet, it wasn't an act of care. It was the first step toward disappearing. The myths were unverified, but fear rarely needed proof. It only needed repetition. They huddled closer now, each echo of those whispers tightening their silence. One woman stared at the ground, afraid that raising her eyes might be seen as defiance. Another fought to steady her breathing, terrified that appearing too weak might draw attention. The third clutched the fence rail, her trembling rooted in a belief that the moment she was lifted, she'd be carried somewhere she would never return from. Shame threaded through all of it. A culture that demanded endurance allowed no room for collapse, no permission for frailty. To fall in front of strangers, especially foreign men, felt like a failure too deep to name. So they kept their terror locked behind stillness even as their bodies begged for help. The cowboys saw exhaustion. The women felt centuries of warning. The cowboys approached with the simplest intentions, water sloshing gently inside metal canteens and wool coats draped over their arms. But even these small gestures stirred panic across the fence line. The women stiffened first, then shrank backward, as though the gifts themselves carried danger. The cowboys paused, boots scuffing against the dry earth, unsure how reaching out could make things worse. One of them crouched low, keeping his hands visible. He eased the canteen forward with slow, deliberate movements, letting it rest on the ground between them. But the nearest woman recoiled so sharply that her heel slipped in the dust. Fear hollowed her breath. She crawled back on trembling elbows, dragging herself away from the object as if it were a trap. The others followed, scrambling weakly, their shoulders pressed together in a shield of instinctive terror. The cowboys exchanged uncertain glances. None of them had expected this. They had seen injured cattle, starving strays, even lost children clinging to survival on the plains, but never grown women who reacted to kindness as if it were capture. One cowboy tried again, setting a folded coat on the dirt several paces away. The fabric slumped gently, harmless, but the women still flinched. Their eyes tracked every motion, wide with the dread of people trained to see rescue as the beginning of disappearance. Then, the weakest among them collapsed again, her body folding inward with a quiet thud. Dust rose around her like a fading signal. Her companions reached for her, but even in their panic, they kept their distance from the men. The cowboys stepped forward on instinct, but stopped themselves, feeling the wall of fear more solid than any fence. They realized then that exhaustion wasn't the enemy they were fighting. Fear was. It outweighed hunger, cold, and even the fading strength in the women's limbs. And unless they found a way to ease that dread, no coat or canteen in the world could bridge the distance between them. They stepped back without a word. Not a retreat, not surrender. Just a widening of space that settled over the plains like a quiet promise. Boots scraped softly across the dirt as the cowboys moved several yards away, forming a loose, respectful arc instead of a wall. Dust drifted between them, carrying no threat, only distance. It was the first gesture that didn't ask anything of the women. Not movement, not trust, not strength they didn't have. For a long moment, nothing changed. The women stayed curled close to the fence line, shoulders tight, breaths shallow and uneven. But the air around them shifted. The pressure of looming figures eased. Their flinching slowly stilled. Fear didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip enough for trembling muscles to stop bracing for the next approach. The woman who had collapsed stirred first, not in panic, but in confusion. She lifted her chin a fraction, as if testing whether danger still lingered. The distance held. No boots followed, no hands reached. She blinked through the dust and morning light, trying to understand why the strangers had moved away when fear had always taught her that predators stepped closer. Beside her, another woman raised her head as well, her movements tentative, almost weightless. She scanned the gap between them and the cowboys, the space wide enough that she could breathe without feeling cornered. Her fingers released the fence rail she'd been gripping, the white-knuckled tension easing by degrees. Finally, the third woman let her gaze drift upward. Her eyes, hollow from exhaustion and dread, met the distant figures in uneven, uncertain glances. One cowboy remained kneeling, but now much farther back, and had in hand, posture soft and open. She didn't understand the gesture, but she understood what hadn't happened. No chase, no force, no punishment. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was the first moment the plains felt still enough for trust to begin imagining itself. Dust lifted in a thin, restless breath across the fence line, stirred by the shifting morning wind. As one of the women tried to steady herself, her coat slipped open at the shoulder, revealing a glimpse beneath the cloth. It wasn't dramatic, not a sudden unveiling, just a quiet, unintended movement that exposed the truth more clearly than any words could have. Her skin, pale beneath layers of dirt, showed the faint shadows of bruising. Old ones fading into yellow and newer ones, shallow and dark, pressed by days of strain. There was no need for detail. The outline of hardship spoke for itself. The cowboy closest to her saw it first. His jaw tensed, the smallest reflex of shock, but he forced the reaction down before it could reach his eyes. He lowered his head slightly, not in shame for her condition, but in an effort to shield her dignity. Moments like this demanded stillness, not pity expressed too boldly, not sorrow that might feel like judgment. He let the dust settle before raising his gaze again, softer this time, careful not to linger where the fabric had fallen aside. Another woman adjusted her torn sleeve, and in the process revealed how thin her arm had become. Skin drawn tight, the shape of bone too defined. It was enough to make the cowboy's chest ache, a quiet tightening under the weight of everything he didn't understand yet. These women hadn't simply collapsed from the heat or from wandering. Their bodies told a story of distance, deprivation, and fear that had outlasted reason. He steadied his breath, reminding himself that any visible sorrow from him would only sharpen their panic. So he held the emotion low in his voice and behind his steady posture, storing it where it couldn't frighten them. The dust swirled again, briefly obscuring the women before drifting away, as if giving them a moment's cover. His conflict deepened, not about whether to help, but how to do so without breaking the fragile calm they'd just begun to reach. They carried the stretcher as if it were something fragile, not because of its weight, but because of the meaning it was about to hold. The cowboys approached only as far as necessary, boots pressing softly into the dust, shoulders lowered in a quiet show of respect. When they reached a safe distance from the women, they set the stretcher down with deliberate care. The canvas eased onto the ground with a muted sigh, blending into the stillness of the plains. No hands reached for the women. No commands followed. When the stretcher settled, The cowboys stepped back immediately, several paces at first, then several more, widening the space until only open air bridged the two groups. The retreat was silent, intentional, and unmistakably gentle. It was the first time the women had been offered something without expectation or pressure. The women stared at the stretcher as though it were both an invitation and a test. Fear still circled them, thin as the dust rising around their knees, but something softer threaded through it now. Freedom of choice, dignity, a chance to move without being moved. One woman shifted, her hands pressed into the dirt, trembling not just from weakness, but from the steady unraveling of her defenses. The others leaned close, not shielding her this time, but supporting her with their presence, their breaths synchronized in hesitant rhythm, each drawing strength from the shared uncertainty. She looked toward the distant cowboys. They did not move. They did not gesture. They simply waited, hats low, hands at their sides. The absence of force was its own language. Slowly, the woman extended a hand toward the stretcher. Not fully, not confidently, just far enough for fingertips to brush the canvas. The touch was feather, light, as though she expected it to vanish if she reached too boldly. But it stayed, solid, safe, real. The other women watched with widening eyes, recognizing this small, trembling motion as something monumental. It was the first step toward accepting safety on her own terms, in her own time. And the cowboys, still several yards away, understood the power of doing nothing but giving space. They nodded first. Small, almost imperceptible motions that might have been missed if the cowboys hadn't been watching with the patience of men who understood silence better than words. The nods weren't bold or certain. They came like faint ripples across tired faces, signals shaped by exhaustion and a cautious acceptance that safety might finally outweigh fear. It was enough. The cowboys approached slowly, each step measured, boots pressing gently into the shifting dust. They kept their hands visible, their voices held back, letting the women guide the moment instead of the other way around. When they reached the stretcher, they paused, giving the women one last chance to refuse. None did. One woman exhaled, long and shaky, the breath of someone choosing trust even while trembling beneath its weight. Two cowboys knelt beside her, moving with the softness usually reserved for newborn calves or fragile tools, passed down through family lines. They slipped their arms beneath her without sudden motion, lifting her with careful coordination, the canvas rising only as fast as her body allowed. She didn't resist. Her hands clutched the edge of the stretcher, not out of fear of them, but to steady herself against the unfamiliar feeling of being held rather than forced. The second woman followed, her body folding into their support, like someone surrendering to gravity she'd fought too long. No words passed between them, only the quiet rustle of clothes and the faint catch of breath as she settled onto the canvas. The third woman hesitated, eyes darting between her companions and the Texans. But when she finally nodded, the gesture carried the weight of a dam breaking. The cowboys lifted her with the same whispering care, as though the plains themselves might crack if they moved too quickly. Behind them, the remaining women whispered, not in panic this time, but in soft relief. Their voices blended with the morning wind, carrying a fragile hope across the fence line. The fear that once defined every motion now loosened its grip, replaced by something quieter, steadier, born from the way these strangers had chosen gentleness over authority. And, as the cowboys began walking toward shelter, the stretcher swaying lightly between them, the women no longer hid their faces. They watched, breathing a little easier, as trust finally found space to grow. They spoke only after the stretcher had been set down in the shade of an old mesquite tree, its branches casting soft, broken shadows across their faces. The wind quieted around them as if waiting. For a long moment, the women kept their eyes lowered, fingers tightening around the fabric beneath them. When words finally escaped, they came in thin, halting threads, fragile confessions shaped by years of holding everything inside. They explained, in voices barely louder than breath, that being touched had never been simple. During the war, a hand reaching toward them often meant inspection, punishment, or separation. Touch had become something to brace against, not trust. Even kindness felt dangerous when life had taught them that the vulnerable were the first to disappear. Their fear wasn't born on the plains of Texas. It had crossed an ocean with them, woven deep into instinct. As they continued, small pieces of their hidden suffering surfaced. One woman described an ankle broken months earlier, wrapped tight with scraps of cloth so others wouldn't notice she was falling behind. Another revealed a shoulder injury from the evacuation march, concealed beneath her coat because showing pain had meant inviting blame. A third whispered about a sister lost during the journey, someone she kept searching for in her dreams. Even now, none of these wounds had been spoken aloud until this morning. The cowboys listened without interrupting, their hats lowered, their faces steady, but softened by the quiet weight of what they heard. The stories weren't dramatic. They were simple, worn-down truths shaped by survival. Each memory showed how war had taken more than strength from these women. It had taken names, roles, and the sense of who they were before fear became a constant companion. In that shaded silence, the women weren't just prisoners or refugees. They were daughters, sisters, and remnants of lives interrupted, their suffering extended far beyond the bruises and exhaustion carved into their bodies. It lived in the way they spoke of themselves as shadows, as people trying to remember how to exist without hiding. Nothing in their voices asked for pity. They offered only honesty, and the men receiving it understood the weight of that gift. They had been taught a story long before they ever crossed the ocean. A story in which foreign men were shadows, merciless and waiting. In those lessons, compassion was a trap, gentleness a disguise, and being lifted from the ground meant being taken somewhere they would not return from. Those warnings had shaped their instincts more deeply than hunger or exhaustion ever could, and for months they had carried them like invisible chains. But now, as they rested beneath the mesquite tree, their breath slow and steady, the memory of that morning's lift pressed quietly against everything they once believed. Nothing in the cowboys' actions resembled the stories etched into them during the war. There had been no harsh commands, no rough hands, no punishment for collapsing in the dust. Instead, the men had moved with a kind of patience that felt almost unfamiliar. Care without possession, assistance without intrusion. It unsettled the old warnings bending them until they no longer fit the world unfolding in front of them. The women replayed the moment they were lifted, not with fear this time, but with a growing realization. The cowboys' hands had supported rather than restrained. The canvas stretcher had carried them toward safety, not away from it. Their bodies, once braced for harm, had surrendered not because they were weak, but because the gentleness offered left no room for resistance. It was a kind of healing neither physical nor immediate, but profound all the same. For the cowboys, the moment held its own quiet weight. They had expected fear, maybe even hostility, but not the depth of belief these women were wrestling against. And as they watched the women slowly reconcile memory with reality, they understood that compassion wasn't simply an act. It was a challenge to the stories war had written into them. What happened on that stretch of Texas dirt was small in movement, but enormous in meaning, a truth powerful enough to unmake a myth. The stories they carried into captivity had been carved into them long before they ever touched American soil. Those stories warned that foreign men would treat them without mercy, that weakness invited cruelty, and that being lifted from the ground meant being taken somewhere from which they would not return. The beliefs were so deeply rooted that even exhaustion could not weaken them, and fear had become a kind of armor they instinctively clung to, even as it dragged them closer to collapse. But the memory of the cowboys' hands, steady, patient, unhurried, pressed against those old teachings like a quiet counterweight. Nothing in the men's movements resembled the warnings whispered during wartime nights. Their approach had carried no threat, their silence no hidden judgment. They had lifted the women not as prisoners, but as people, as if the simple fact of being human was enough to deserve care. The contrast struck with a force more disarming than any weapon could have been. As the women rested, supported by blankets the cowboys had placed beneath them, they found themselves replaying the moment of being lifted. The canvas stretcher had not been a trap, and the hands beneath them had not closed in possession. There had been only gentleness, care offered without condition, strength used without dominance. It unsettled the myths they had been taught, loosening fear from the inside. For the first time, the world felt larger than the stories that once ruled it. The cowboys sensed the shift, too. They saw it in the way the women breathed more evenly, in how their eyes no longer darted toward every movement. They realized that compassion could do what words could not. It could rewrite what fear had carved. And somewhere in that quiet space, a kind of healing began, slow, fragile, but undeniably real. The small ranch infirmary held a stillness that felt almost foreign after the struggle on the plains. Morning light drifted through the wooden slats, soft and gold, settling gently across the three women who now rested on clean cots. Their breathing had steadied into a quiet rhythm, each rise and fall of their chests a quiet reassurance that the worst of the morning had passed. The cowboys moved carefully around them, their boots softened against the old floorboards, mindful not to disturb the fragile peace settling over the room. For the first time since they had been found by the fence line, the women slept without fear tightening their limbs. Their hands, once clenched in instinctive defense, now rested open at their sides. Warm blankets had replaced the cold dirt, and the sharp wind outside no longer touched them. The room felt like a world apart from the plains where desperation had nearly swallowed them. It felt like a place where the war could not quite reach. Outside, the ranch hands spoke in quiet tones, aware that what had happened that morning would linger far beyond their land. Stories of compassion had echoed throughout the war, scattered among the harsher truths, unnoticed by history's louder moments. There were soldiers who shared rations with the starving, nurses who sheltered infants born in captivity, farmers who offered water to those who had marched too far. Small acts, almost invisible, yet they shaped the human landscape of conflict as surely as battle lines did. The scene inside the infirmary now joined that quiet thread of history. 3 women, lifted when they could no longer stand, found safety in a place they had been taught to fear. 3 cowboys, shaped by a land known for its toughness, revealed a gentleness that crossed every boundary the war had drawn. And, in the stillness of that Texas morning, the truth settled with undeniable clarity: war might divide nations, but humanity, steady, simple, and unspoken, has always been able to heal what fear breaks.